The December wind howled across the Montana plains like a hungry wolf, carrying with it the promise of a blizzard that would bury everything under 3 feet of snow. Jake Morrison pulled his worn leather jacket tighter around his shoulders as he checked the fence line one last time before dark. At 42, he had spent the better part of 2 decades working this ranch alone, and the isolation had become as much a part of him as the calluses on his hands. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air as he secured the gate to the north pasture. The weather forecast had been grim all week, but Jake had seen storms before. What worried him more was the report of a car breakdown somewhere along the county road that bordered his property. The sheriff's office had mentioned it on the radio, but with the storm approaching, search efforts would be limited until morning. Jake climbed back into his pickup truck, the engine protesting against the cold before finally turning over. As he drove toward his cabin, the headlights cut through the growing darkness, illuminating swirling snow that had begun to fall in earnest. The radio crackled with static, occasionally breaking through with updates about road closures and weather warnings. He had almost reached the turnoff to his driveway when he saw her. A figure stumbled along the roadside, barely visible through the snow. Jake's foot hit the brakes harder than he intended, sending the truck into a slight skid on the already slick pavement. He pulled over quickly, leaving the engine running and the headlights on as he stepped out into the storm. The woman was small, maybe 5'4", with dark hair plastered to her head from the falling snow. Her clothes were completely inadequate for the weather, a thin jacket, jeans, and what looked like sneakers that were probably soaked through. She was shivering so violently that Jake could see it even from several feet away. "Ma'am," he called out, having to raise his voice over the wind. "Are you hurt?" She looked up at him with eyes that reflected exhaustion and something close to desperation. Her lips had taken on a bluish tint that made Jake's chest tighten with concern. When she tried to speak, her teeth chattered so hard that the words came out broken. "My car," she managed to say, pointing weakly down the road, "broke down about 2 miles back. Been walking for—" She paused, swaying slightly on her feet. "I don't know how long." Jake didn't hesitate. He moved quickly to her side, noting how she seemed to lean into any warmth his body provided. "We need to get you somewhere warm right now," he said, gently taking her elbow to guide her toward his truck. "Can you make it to my vehicle?" She nodded, though Jake wasn't entirely convinced she was fully aware of her surroundings anymore. He helped her into the passenger seat, immediately cranking up the heat and angling the vents toward her. As he walked around to the driver's side, he grabbed a heavy blanket from the truck bed, something he always carried during winter months. "Here," he said, draping the blanket around her shoulders once he was back in the cab. "My place is just up ahead. We'll have you warmed up in no time." As they drove the short distance to his cabin, Jake stole glances at his unexpected passenger. She had stopped shivering quite so violently, which was a good sign, but she still looked like someone who had been through an ordeal. Her hands, he noticed, were red and raw from the cold. "I'm Jake Morrison," he said, trying to fill the silence with something other than the sound of wind and snow against the windshield. "Sarah," she replied, her voice still weak but clearer than it had been on the road. "Sarah Chun, I was driving to Billings to see my sister, but my car just died. The engine started making this awful noise, and then it just stopped." She pulled the blanket tighter around herself. "I thought I could walk to find help, but the storm came in so fast." Jake nodded, understanding how quickly weather could change in this part of the country. "You're lucky I found you when I did," he said, though he didn't want to frighten her by explaining just how dangerous her situation had been. Hypothermia could set in faster than most people realized, and in a storm like this, search teams wouldn't be able to look for missing persons until the weather cleared. The cabin came into view, its windows glowing warmly against the stark landscape. Jake had built most of it himself over the years, starting with a basic structure and adding rooms as time and money allowed. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid and warm, with a stone fireplace that could heat the main living area even when the power went out. "Is there room in your barn?" Sarah asked suddenly, her voice so quiet that Jake almost missed it over the sound of the storm. "I don't want to impose, and I know this is an inconvenience." Jake looked at her with something between surprise and concern. "The barn," he repeated. "Ma'am, you're not staying in any barn tonight? You're coming inside where it's warm, and we're going to get you taken care of properly." He parked as close to the front door as possible, then came around to help Sarah out of the truck. Her legs were unsteady, and Jake found himself essentially carrying most of her weight as they made their way up the front steps. The wind was picking up even more, and snow was beginning to accumulate in drifts against the cabin walls. Once inside, Jake guided Sarah to the couch near the fireplace, where the remnants of his evening fire still provided some warmth. The cabin's interior was simple but comfortable: wood floors, handmade furniture, and walls lined with books and a few family photographs. It was the home of a man who valued function over decoration. But there was something undeniably welcoming about the space. "Let me get this fire built back up," Jake said, kneeling beside the fireplace and adding fresh logs to the coals. "And then we need to get you into some dry clothes before you catch pneumonia." Sarah sat on the edge of the couch, still wrapped in the blanket, watching Jake work. There was something methodical and sure about the way he moved, building the fire with the confidence of someone who had done it thousands of times. Within minutes, flames were crackling and casting dancing shadows across the room. "I should call someone," Sarah said, reaching for what Jake assumed was her phone. "Let people know I'm okay." "The phone lines are down," Jake told her, standing and brushing his hands off on his jeans. "Storm took them out about an hour ago. Cell service is spotty out here on good days, and with this weather—" He gestured toward the window, where snow was now falling so heavily that the barn was barely visible. "But don't worry about that right now. First things first, we need to get you warmed up properly." Jake disappeared into what Sarah assumed was a bedroom, returning with an armload of clothes, thermal underwear, wool socks, a heavy sweater, and sweatpants that would obviously be too big for her but would be warm and dry. "The bathroom's just down the hall," he said, setting the clothes on the coffee table. "There's a shower if you want to warm up that way, and fresh towels in the cabinet. Take your time. I'll make some coffee and see what I can put together for dinner." Sarah looked at the clothes, then back at Jake. There was something in her expression that he couldn't quite read, gratitude mixed with something else. Maybe disbelief that a stranger would show her such kindness without expecting anything in return. "I don't know how to thank you," she said finally. "I was so scared out there. I really thought I might—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Jake understood. "You don't need to thank me," he replied. Anyone would have done the same thing. But even as he said it, Jake knew that wasn't entirely true. He had lived alone for so long that having another person in his space felt strange, almost overwhelming. For years, his world had consisted of the ranch, his animals, and the occasional trip to town for supplies. He had convinced himself that he preferred the solitude, that other people were complications he didn't need, yet something about finding Sarah on that road, seeing her vulnerability and determination to survive, had awakened something in him that he thought he had buried long ago. Maybe it was simple human decency. Or maybe it was something more complicated that he wasn't ready to examine too closely. As Sarah headed toward the bathroom with the borrowed clothes, Jake busied himself in the kitchen. The cabin's layout was open enough that he could hear the shower running while he rummaged through his refrigerator and pantry. He wasn't much of a cook. Years of bachelor living had reduced his culinary skills to the basics, but he could manage a decent meal when the situation called for it. He settled on making chili, something that would be warm and filling and could simmer while they talked. As he browned ground beef and chopped onions, Jake found himself listening for sounds from the bathroom, making sure Sarah was all right. The storm continued to rage outside, rattling the windows and sending occasional downdrafts through the chimney that made the fire flicker. When Sarah emerged from the bathroom 20 minutes later, she looked like a completely different person. Her color had returned to normal, and Jake's clothes, while comically oversized, made her look smaller and somehow younger. She had pulled her damp hair back into a ponytail, and without the exhaustion and near hypothermia, Jake could see that she was actually quite beautiful. "Feel better?" he asked, stirring the chili and trying to ignore the way his pulse had quickened when she entered the room. Like a human being again, Sarah said, settling back on the couch near the fire. I can't believe how quickly I got that cold. I've lived in Montana my whole life, but I've never Jake woke before dawn, as he had every morning for the past 15 years. But this time, the sound that pulled him from sleep wasn't his usual internal clock or the distant lowing of cattle. It was the unfamiliar presence of another person in his house. The soft sound of someone moving carefully through his kitchen. He found Sarah standing at the window above the sink, looking out at a world transformed by snow. The storm had stopped sometime during the night, leaving behind drifts that reached nearly to the cabin's windowsills and a landscape so white and pristine it looked like a photograph. I hope you don't mind, she said without turning around. I made coffee. I'm usually up early anyway, and I thought you probably were too. Jake accepted the mug she offered, noting that she had somehow found the good coffee he kept hidden behind the everyday stuff. Most people sleep in when they've had a night like you did, he observed. Old habits, Sarah said with a shrug. Emergency calls don't wait for convenient times. When you're a large animal vet, you get used to functioning on very little sleep. They stood together at the window, drinking coffee and watching the sun rise over the snow-covered ranch. In daylight, Jake could see that the storm had been even worse than he had thought. Several trees had come down, and the road was completely impassable. His truck might be able to make it through some of the drifts, but it would be dangerous. And there was no guarantee they could get all the way to town. Looks like we're going to be roommates for at least another day, Jake said. I'm sorry, Sarah replied quickly. I know this isn't what you signed up for when you stopped to help me. Jake looked at her, surprised by the apology. She was wearing the same borrowed clothes from the night before, but she had managed to make them look less ridiculous, rolling up the sleeves and cuffs so they fit better. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and without makeup, she looked younger and somehow more real than most women he encountered in town. Don't apologize, he said. I'm not exactly suffering here. It was true, though Jake wasn't entirely comfortable admitting it, even to himself. He had expected to feel claustrophobic, anxious about having his routine disrupted and his space invaded. Instead, he had slept better than he had in months, and waking up to the sound of someone else in his kitchen had felt surprisingly natural. What's your morning routine usually like? Sarah asked, seeming genuinely interested. Feed the cattle, check the equipment, fix whatever broke overnight, Jake said. Not very exciting. Can I help? The question caught Jake off guard. Help? I'm a veterinarian, remember? I know my way around cattle. And I'm going crazy just sitting here thinking about everything I should be doing instead. Jake considered this. Having help with the morning chores would certainly make things go faster, especially with the added complications from the storm. And there was something appealing about the idea of sharing the work with someone who understood it, even if only temporarily. Bundle up, he said finally. It's going to be cold out there. 20 minutes later, they were trudging through knee-deep snow toward the barn, Jake carrying buckets of feed and Sarah following in his footsteps to make the walking easier. The cold was brutal, but the air was crisp and clean, and Jake found himself enjoying the companionship in a way that surprised him. How many head do you run? Sarah asked as they reached the barn. About 200, depending on the season, Jake replied, sliding open the heavy door. Most of them are in the far pastures right now, but I keep the pregnant cows and the older animals closer to the barn during winter. The barn was warm and filled with the familiar smells of hay and animals. Jake had always found something comforting about the space, but seeing it through Sarah's eyes, he noticed details he usually took for granted, the way the morning light filtered through the windows, the soft sounds of cattle settling in their stalls, the cats that appeared from various hiding places as soon as they heard footsteps. This is beautiful, Sarah said, running her hand along the worn wood of a stall door. You built this yourself? Most of it, Jake confirmed. Added on to the original structure over the years. They worked together in comfortable silence. Jake distributing feed while Sarah checked water troughs and examined the animals with the practiced eye of a professional. Jake found himself watching her work, impressed by her competence and the gentle way she handled the cattle. "You've got a cow in early labor over here," Sarah called from one of the back stalls. "Probably still a few hours away, but you'll want to keep an eye on her." Jake joined her beside a black Angus cow who was showing the early signs of calving. "Good catch," he said. "I probably wouldn't have noticed until this evening." "It's what I do," Sarah said with a smile. "Though I have to admit, it feels good to be working instead of sitting around feeling helpless." They finished the morning chores in half the time it usually took Jake alone. As they walked back toward the cabin, Sarah suddenly stopped and pointed toward the road. "Is that my car?" Jake squinted through the snow and could just make out the shape of a small sedan, nearly buried under a drift about a quarter-mile away. "Looks like it. Want to take a look?" Getting to the car required a trek through deep snow that left both of them breathing hard by the time they reached it. Sarah's little Honda was completely stuck, with snow packed around the wheels and under the chassis. But the real problem was immediately obvious even to someone who wasn't mechanically inclined. "There's your issue," Jake said, pointing to a puddle of dark fluid that had melted the snow beneath the engine. "Radiator. Probably cracked in the cold." Sarah stared at the car with a mixture of frustration and resignation. "How bad is it?" "Hard to say without looking closer, but if I had to guess, you're looking at a tow to town and probably a few $100s in repairs," Jake said honestly. "Maybe more." "Perfect," Sarah muttered. "Just perfect." Jake could hear the stress in her voice and realized that this breakdown represented more than just an inconvenience for her. "Money tight right now?" he asked gently. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "Starting a veterinary practice isn't cheap. Most of my money goes back into equipment and supplies. I was counting on this car lasting at least another 2 years. They walked back to the cabin in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Jake found himself wanting to help beyond just providing temporary shelter, though he wasn't sure what he could offer. When they reached the house, Sarah headed immediately for the phone. "Still dead," she reported after checking the line. "My sister's going to think I'm dead in a ditch somewhere." "The phone company will have crews out as soon as the roads are clear," Jake assured her. "Probably by tomorrow." Sarah sat heavily on the couch, suddenly looking overwhelmed by everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. Jake recognized the feeling, that moment when the adrenaline wears off and you realize how drastically your plans have changed. "Hey," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "It's going to work out. We'll get your car looked at, get you in touch with your family, figure out the next steps. Why do you care?" Sarah asked suddenly. "I mean, you've already done more than anyone could expect. You saved my life, you fed me, given me a place to stay. You don't owe me anything else?" It was a fair question, and one that Jake had been asking himself since the night before. The honest answer was complicated, involving feelings he hadn't examined in years and wasn't sure he was ready to explore. "Maybe I'm being selfish," he said finally. "It's been a long time since I've had someone to talk to. Someone who understands what it's like to work with animals, to build something from nothing." Sarah studied his face, and Jake had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see more than he intended to reveal. "Is that really all it is?" she asked. Jake met her gaze, feeling something shift between them. The air in the cabin seemed to grow warmer, more charged, as if the storm outside had somehow intensified the atmosphere within. "No," he admitted quietly. "I don't think it is." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sarah stood and moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. "This is complicated," she said finally. "It doesn't have to be." Sarah turned back to face him. "Doesn't it? I live 3 hours away. My whole life is in Missoula, my practice, my clients, my house. And you—" she gestured around the cabin. "Your life is here. People make long-distance relationships work all the time," Jake said, surprised by his own boldness. "Is that what this is? A relationship?" Jake stood and moved closer to her, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "I don't know what it is," he said honestly. "I just know that I haven't felt this way about anyone in a very long time." "Maybe ever?" Sarah's breath caught slightly, and Jake could see the conflict playing across her features. Attraction warring with practicality, hope fighting with experience. "Jake," she said softly. "I know it's crazy," he continued. "I know we barely know each other, and the circumstances are unusual, and there are 1,000 reasons why it wouldn't work. But sometimes—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Sometimes you meet someone and you just know that they're going to change your life." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she stepped closer, close enough that Jake could feel the warmth radiating from her body. 3 months after the storm, Jake found himself standing in the parking lot of the Mountain View Veterinary Clinic in Missoula, holding a bouquet of wildflowers he had picked from his own pastures and wondering if he had completely lost his mind. The drive from his ranch had taken nearly 3 hours, and he still wasn't entirely sure what he was going to say when he saw Sarah. They had talked every day since she left. Long conversations that stretched late into the evening and left Jake feeling more connected to another person than he had ever thought possible. But talking on the phone and building something real were two different things, and the distance between them had started to feel like an insurmountable obstacle. The bell above the clinic door chimed as Jake entered, and he found himself in a comfortable waiting room filled with the usual collection of pet owners and their animals. A young woman behind the reception desk looked up from her computer. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Dr. Chun," Jake said, suddenly aware that he hadn't called ahead to let Sarah know he was coming. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, Jake paused, realizing how he must look, a rancher in his best jeans and cleanest work shirt, holding flowers and clearly out of place in the sterile environment of a veterinary clinic. "I'm a friend of hers, Jake Morrison." The receptionist's expression brightened immediately. "Oh, you're the Jake. Sarah's told us all about you." She picked up the phone and pressed a button. "Dr. Chun? There's someone here to see you." Jake could hear Sarah's voice through the phone, though he couldn't make out the words. The receptionist smiled and hung up. "She be right out. She's just finishing up with a patient." Jake nodded and took a seat, trying to ignore the curious glances from the other people in the waiting room. A few minutes later, Sarah appeared from the back of the clinic, wearing scrubs and a surprised expression that quickly transformed into a smile that made Jake's chest tighten with relief. "What are you doing here?" she asked, accepting the flowers with a laugh. "Not that I'm complaining, but you could have called." "I wanted to surprise you," Jake said. "And I wanted to ask you something, but I needed to do it in person." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, her expression growing more serious. "Let me just finish up here, and then we can talk." "Give me 15 minutes?" Jake nodded, and Sarah disappeared back into the clinic. While he waited, Jake found himself thinking about all the conversations they had shared over the past 3 months, talks about their work, their dreams, their fears about taking a chance on something that seemed impossible. Sarah had visited the ranch twice, long weekends that had only convinced Jake that he wanted her in his life permanently. When Sarah emerged again, she had changed out of her scrubs and into jeans and a sweater that made her look younger and more approachable. "Come on," she said, taking his hand. "Let's go somewhere we can talk privately." They ended up at a small coffee shop a few blocks from the clinic, sitting across from each other at a table by the window. Sarah arranged the wildflowers in a water glass she had commandeered from the counter, and Jake found himself memorizing the way the afternoon light caught in her hair. "So," Sarah said, folding her hands on the table, "what's this big question you needed to ask me in person?" Jake took a deep breath, suddenly aware that everything he had planned to say had evaporated from his mind. Instead, he found himself just looking at her, really looking, and thinking about how much his life had changed since that night in December. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said finally. "About us, about what we want, about how to make this work. And I think I've been approaching this all wrong," Jake continued. "I've been so focused on the obstacles, the distance, our different lives, the logistics of everything, that I almost missed the most important part." Sarah leaned forward slightly, her expression curious. "Which is?" I love you, Jake said simply. I love the way you handle scared animals and difficult clients. I love that you make terrible coffee but great pancakes. I love that you're not afraid of hard work or getting your hands dirty. I love that you argue with me when you think I'm being stubborn. And I love that you're usually right. Sarah's breath caught slightly, and Jake could see tears gathering in her eyes. I love that you saved my life, she said softly. But more than that, I love that you saw something in me worth saving. I love your quiet strength and your terrible jokes and the way you take care of everything around you without expecting anything in return. So the question I came here to ask, Jake said, reaching across the table to take her hands, is not whether you want to try to make a long-distance relationship work. The question is, will you marry me? Sarah stared at him for a moment, clearly stunned. Jake, I know it's crazy, Jake said quickly. I know we've only known each other for 3 months, and I know there are still a lot of practical things to figure out. But I also know that I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. And I don't want to spend the next year driving back and forth between here and the ranch, always saying goodbye. What exactly are you proposing? Sarah asked carefully. I mean, logistically. My practice is here, your ranch is there. How would it work? Jake had been hoping she would ask that question because it was the one he had an answer for. I've been talking to some people, he said. There are ways to make it work if we're both willing to compromise. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket and spread it on the table. It was a rough map of the area between his ranch and Missoula, with several locations marked in red. I've been thinking about expanding the ranch operation anyway, Jake said. Adding a side business that would bring in additional income and give me more flexibility. What if we started a mobile veterinary service? You could keep your practice here part-time, but we could also serve the ranches and farms between here and my place. Sarah studied the map, her expression growing more interested. That's actually not a terrible idea. There's definitely a need for large animal services in that area. But the startup costs alone ... I can provide the capital, Jake said. The ranch is doing well, and I've got some savings. We could start small, a truck, basic equipment, build up a client base. Eventually, if it takes off, maybe we expand to include other veterinarians. And you'd be involved in this business? As much as you'd want me to be. I know ranch work, I know the people in the area. I could handle a lot of the non-medical aspects, scheduling, transportation, client relations. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying the map and clearly thinking through the possibilities. Jake forced himself to wait to let her process the idea, without pressuring her for an immediate answer. You've really thought this through, she said finally. I've had a lot of time to think since that night you showed up half frozen on my road, Jake replied. About what I want, about what kind of life I want to build, and everything I come up with involves you. Sarah looked up from the map to meet his eyes. Jake, I need you to understand something. If I say yes, if we do this, it has to be because you want a partner in life, not because you want to rescue someone. I know the difference, Jake said firmly. What I felt that night when I found you in the storm, that was about helping someone who needed help. What I feel now is about wanting to share my life with someone who makes me better. Someone who challenges me and supports me and makes me remember why I wanted to build something meaningful in the first place. And if the business doesn't work out, if we can't make the logistics work, then we figure something else out, Jake said with a shrug. The business is just a means to an end. The end is us, together, building a life that works for both of us. Sarah smiled, and Jake could see the exact moment when she made her decision. In that case, she said yes. Yes to marrying me or yes to the business? Yes to both, Sarah said, leaning across the table to kiss him. Yes to all of it. Jake felt something inside his chest expand. Something that had been compressed and hidden for so long he had forgotten it existed. Joy, he realized. Pure, uncomplicated joy. Really? He asked, still not quite believing it. Really, Sarah confirmed. Though I have some conditions, name them. First, we do this right. We take time to plan the business properly. Make sure we have adequate funding and a solid client base before we make any major changes to my practice here. Jake nodded. That makes sense. Second, we get to know each other better before we set a wedding date. 3 months is not very long, no matter how intense those 3 months have been. Fair enough. How long do you want? Sarah considered this. Let's see how the next 6 months go. If we can survive planning a business together and spending more time in each other's space, then we'll know we can handle marriage. Agreed. What's the third condition? Sarah grinned. The wedding is at the ranch. I want to get married where we met, where you first opened your home to me. Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. I think that can be arranged. They spent the rest of the afternoon talking through details, making lists and plans and dreaming out loud about the life they wanted to build together. By the time Jake had to head back to the ranch that evening, they had outlined a business plan, set a timeline for Sarah to gradually transition some of her responsibilities to other veterinarians, and begun discussing the practical aspects of combining Thigh.